From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning. I am Jim Billington, the Librarian of Congress, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Library of Congress Symposium on Carl Jung and the Red Book. I am glad that the symposium has generated so much interest, as the crowd here assembled clearly indicates. It's possible that Jung would have been uncomfortable with the location of this symposium. In one of his visions in the Red Book, he describes a bad experience he had in a library. While there, Jung was beset by a squadron of ghosts of persecuted 16th century Anabaptists. The squadron was on its way to Jerusalem to pray at holy sites when Jung struck up a conversation. The Anabaptist leader and the chief librarian of an unidentified library, to be sure, called the police and had him committed to the local insane asylum. On the other hand, I suspect that Jung might have found this library not entirely uncongenial, since the exhibit that is upstairs, and you will have a chance to see in the course of the day, is right next to Jefferson's reconstituted library. Jefferson organized knowledge, as you may be aware, on three categories: memory, reason, and imagination. Contrast that with the multiple subdivisions of knowledge that you'll find in bureaucratized academia today. But it certainly bears in Jefferson's life, as well as his library, the kind of active imagination that was one of the trademarks of Freud's thinking. So as Librarian of Congress, I think this library, being a multimedial resource of all kinds with unparalleled collections of music, of prints and photographs, of cinema, of all kinds of expressions of the creative imagination, I think it's appropriate. And also, in my sometime capacity as a historian of Russian culture, and this is not in the exhibit, but it's something that struck me as I was reading some of this material and going through the exhibit. In the 10 years that Russia lived without censorship, there were only 10 years in their history up until the fall of the Soviet system, there was an explosion of creativity, which, if not directly influenced by Jung, was certainly has many points of parallel movement on the voyage of Russian culture, as it literally exploded after a long period in the decade between 1907 and 1917. There were the late Rimsky-Korsakov and the early Kandinsky both believed that there was, since both sound and light were thought to be solely transmitted by waves, that they must both be expressions of some deeper formation and some deeper elements in what they didn't call, but I think implicitly acknowledged was a kind of unconscious or subconscious level out of which culture came. And so you can see in their works of that period, and even more in the works of Scriabin and a whole bunch of other people. Scriabin, who wanted to introduce the other senses, sight, and not just sight and sound, but touch and smell as part of the aroma of messages, so to speak, that multimedia culture had. The climax of the enormous fertility of what Russians are today rediscovering in what's from what they used to call the Silver Age or the Russian Renaissance was a great project that lasted on to the 20s until its leader, Pavel Florensky, was executed in the Gulag, one of the earliest of gulags, was a universal dictionary of symbols called Symbolaria. That, in post-Soviet Russia, that is a major project of one of their great minds and the founder of the Russian School of Semiotics, a man named Ivanov, whom we've been fortunate to have on our advisory council here at the Kluge Center within the library. So if not directly influenced by Jung, it's interesting that there was a kind of parallel track of deep investigation, with this project as having very obvious resemblances to the work and the aspirations of Jung. So I think there's much more probably to be discovered in terms of parallelisms and perhaps of direct influences yet to be unveiled from the still imperfectly inventoried world record. The stage sets of Rerick, many of which are in another small repository in New York, look very much like the mandalas that you see in the Red Book. The Red Book, you know, as you know, was published in digital facsimile in 2009 after being accessible to the public since its creation several decades earlier. It was the product of an extraordinary, entirely unanticipated period in Jung's life from 1913 to 1917, during which he endured what he called a prolonged confrontation with his unconscious, which produced a stream of fantasies, visions, dreams, which were so strange and frightening that he later said they, quote, threatened to break me, end of quote. Both he and the ghostly figure in the Librarian in Jung's account that I just alluded to thought that he might be going mad. Jung, however, summoned the moral and intellectual stamina to distance himself from these assaults from the unconscious, even as they intruded on him. In an effort to understand his experiences, Jung recorded them in words and artwork in the Red Book, the original of which is on display 2 floors above you in our Jung exhibit. Everything, Jung later said, derived from confrontations with the unconscious. The experiences he described in the Red Book furnished him with the raw material to construct his system of analytical psychology, excuse me, one of the major efforts of the 20th century to unlock the mysteries of the human mind. Today, we will hear a distinguished group of Jungian experts from the United States and Europe. We thank them all for coming, often from long distances, to explain and assess the experiences that Jung described in the Red Book. They may also tell us what impact they think the Red Book will have outside the Jungian community on psychology and related fields. So I look forward to an intellectual feast, as I'm sure we all do. Many individuals and organizations have assisted us in making it financially possible to mount our exhibit and to present today's symposium. And I'm happy to recognize them: the James Madison Council of the Library of Congress, the Oswald Family Foundation, the Honorable J. Richard Fredericks, one of our former ambassadors to Switzerland, the Embassy of Switzerland, the Jung Society of Washington, the Philemon Society, the Archives for Research for Archetypal Symbolism, the International Association for Analytic Psychology. And in addition, contributions from the C.J. Jung Institute of San Francisco, W.W. Norton and Company, the Honorable Joseph B. Gildenhorn, a more recent ambassador to Switzerland, and the Jungian Analysts of Washington Association. Finally, let me conclude on a more personal note that the staging of this event, I think, owes a good deal to an old friend of mine who I had a chance to have some deep conversations with in 2003, Phil Zabriskie, known to many of you, Jungian analyst, and his widow, Beverley Zabriskie, another luminary among the Jungian scholars and practitioners who will chair the first session. And ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to now get out of the way and turn it over to the experts, beginning with the highly esteemed and great friend, Beverley Zabriskie.
Good morning and welcome. And as a Jungian analyst, I like the backstories and the hidden stories. So I would just like to tell you a few of those. First of all, I want to thank James Billington, a gentleman and a scholar, and we are lucky to have him serving the library and serving the country. 60 years ago this month, James Billington graduated from Princeton as the valedictorian of the class, and Philip Zabriskie was the salutatorian. And the two of them went off to Oxford, and fast forward to 2003, and there's the 100th anniversary of the Rhodes Scholars at Oxford and in London. And at a dinner together, Jim mentioned the idea of a Jung exhibit at the Library of Congress, and he and Philip began to discuss this. And he said, but what was needed was a centerpiece, a Jungian centerpiece around which an exhibit could be formed. We were in London, we called up Sonu Shamdasani. Sonu came over, had dinner together, and that was the night that the idea for this exhibit really began to take form. And Sonu already was working on the possibility of the Red Book. He'd been working on it since, I believe, 1997. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But it was in conversation and it was in friendship among scholars and gentlemen that this idea really emerged. And then when the Red Book was published, it was thanks to Sonu's work with the members of the Jung family, 3 of whom are here, and I would like you to know them. Andreas Jung, who is Jung's grandson and the occupant of Jung's house in Kusnacht, and he is and his wife Rainey. And that home, thanks to their efforts, is going to become a public foundation. So would you stand? And Eric Baumann, a great-grandson. It's just in terms of Jungian history, the Red Book has become a means through which so many different arenas of the Jungian world have come together, the family and the scholars and the analysts. And so it's had that synthesizing effect. And to come as an analyst and see that poster in front of the Library of Congress facing Capitol Hill with Jung's Red Book on it, if a patient came in and told me that was a dream, I would be seriously in doubt of their grandiosity and inflation. But I hope and trust that the energy of the Red Book, which was about Jung befriending those who might be considered enemies in his psyche, that some of that spirit gets across the avenue. And I have heard that there is now a tunnel between Capitol Hill and the Library of Congress. A passageway. So let's hope that above ground and underground we begin to affect the American psyche. None of this would have been without the extraordinary devotion and dedication of Jung to his own unconscious and to his psyche. And as I say, rather than experiencing what emerged as frightening and to be eschewed and confronted as enemy, he did it in the spirit of befriending that which was within him. And the devotion that he showed really is a path, a passageway for all of us to deal with the enemies within so we don't project them without. And Jung was very lucky to have caught the attention of a man of similar devotion and dedication, Sonu Shamdasani. Sonu was born in India, and when Sonu was 18 years old, he went to India to find his guru. And while there, he picked up a copy of Jung's Secret of the Golden Flower, and then the next year started reading Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and read that one finds one's guru within. And that began a very long and, as I said, dedicated career. With Steve Martin, Sonu founded the Hillman Association and Foundation, and the president, Nancy Ferlati, is here with us today, and they have taken on the enormous task of publishing the 38,000 unpublished letters of Jung's and another 30 volumes worth of unpublished material. And I heard many asking Sonu, what was he going to do now that the Red Book was completed? I thought I would save him having to answer and you having to ask by telling you that he is embarked on putting together a reconstruction of the formation of modern psychological disciplines and therapeutics, and also a reconstruction of the formation of work of Jung based on primary archival materials. Sonu has read every Jung document at the ETH in Zurich. He has, since 1988, been prowling the stacks of the Library of Congress, and he probably knows more about Jung than anyone else who has ever lived besides Jung. And as the co-founder and executive editor of the Hillman Foundation, he is continuing this work with their support. And Sonu also has another life as a scholar. He is the Hillman Professor of Jung at the Wellcome Trust Centre for the History of Medicine at University College London. So it is my enormous privilege and pleasure to introduce the man without whom the Red Book would not be here and we would not be gathered in this room today. Sonu.
Jung's Liber Novus is a descent into hell, Jung's hell and possibly our own. My theme this morning is hell, and coming here this morning, I think it may have been easier to get into than this symposium. The sign on the gates of hell in Dante's Commedia, "Abandon all hope, all who enter here," might not be out of keeping or come to mind when individuals first begin to grapple with Liber Novus, the spirit of the depths, and the dark denizens that lurk within. But all is not lost. As a denizen of this domain, nailed and chained to this book for what seemed fast approaching an eternity, and close at times to turning into a shade myself, I'd like this morning to provide some short dispatches from hell to help you on your descent. As the Christian designation for the dwelling of the dead, depictions of hell from the outset were superimposed upon classical descriptions of the underworld, or Hades. The first major Christian description of hell occurs in the apocryphal Apocalypse of Peter. In this, Christ shows Peter hell in graphic detail: people hanging by their tongues, a lake of flaming mire, another full of pus, clouds of worms, people gnawing their tongues and having flaming fire in their tongues, and metal detectors everywhere. The key trait of these and similar depictions is the notion that in hell, punishments enact the nature of sins. In his 1893 work on this text, Nekaya, Albrecht Dietrich argued that the Apocalypse of Peter drew heavily on Orphic Pythagorean traditions. Now, at the outset of Liber Novus, two descents have an exemplary role: Odysseus' descent into the underworld in the Odyssey, and Christ's descent into hell. Descents to the underworld feature in different traditions. And as the underworld has been a main theme in the speaker that follows me, James Hillman, I pass all questions on the underworld to him. First to Odysseus. Book 11 of the Odyssey depicts Odysseus' descent into the underworld to consult Tiresias. To enter the land of the dead, libations mixed with honey, milk, then sweet wine and white barley were made. They then cut the throats of sheep, probably organic in that time. Tiresias then gives warning and advice concerning what lies in store. We will return to this motif but just like to put this as one of the backdrops to the terrain we'll be entering. The second major theme is that of Christ's descent into hell, the harrowing of hell. The Apostles' Creed states that he descended into hell, the third day he rose again from the dead. It's very brief. But what indeed took place there? Accounts are found in the Apocryphal Gospels of his descent into hell to preach to the dead, to redeem the dead, and to redeem Adam. This formed one of, you could say, the major themes in Christian theology until a reaction set in the Protestant Reformation. Zwingli, for example, took the account of Christ's descent simply to indicate that he had really died. Calvin dismissed it merely as a fable. The fusion of classical descriptions of the underworld and the Christian hell reaches its apotheosis in the most famous depictions we have of hell, that is Dante's Commedia. It's Botticelli's hell. In presenting his vision of hell and one's journey through it, Dante also presented a hermeneutics of how the text should be read. In his famous letter to Can Grande della Scala, he differentiated two modes in which the Commedia could be read. The first sense is that which comes from the letter. The second is that which is signified by the letter. The first is called the literal, the second allegorical or moral or anagogical. And he differentiated them in this text in the following manner. The subject of the whole work, taken only from the literal standpoint, is simply the status of the soul after death, taken simply. If the work is taken allegorically, however, the subject is man, either gaining or losing merit, through his freedom of the will, subject to the justice of being rewarded or punished. Two modes of reading, then, and in the second, hell features in an allegorical sense. As the historian D.P. Walker notes, hell began to lose its hold in the 17th century. And there were many reasons for this. The weakness of scriptural arguments for hell, the decline of the notion of retributive justice, the rise of rationalist modes of thought, and problems concerning the precise location of hell, traditionally conceived of as in the bowels of the Library of Congress, in the earth. For example, in his article in Diderot and d'Alembert's Encyclopédie, Swidden argued that the number of the damned argued against the location of hell in its traditional place inside the earth. It was simply overcrowded. I mean, there was no place to fit them all. The only place big enough was the sun, and this had the added virtue as it provided enough heat for the eternal flames. So even then, they were in problems of global warming, ecology. Where are we going to find enough heat to burn everyone? Alongside this notion of the problem concerning the literal hell and its location was a metaphorical use of the word hell. The Oxford English Dictionary characterizes this as a place, state, or situation of wickedness, suffering, or misery. Place, state, or situation of wickedness, suffering, or misery. And it notes instances of first usage going back in the English language to Chaucer. In Milton's Paradise Lost, Satan, always a reliable figure, states, "The mind is its own place, and it itself can make a heaven of hell a hell of heaven." Satan knew a thing or two about hell. An instance of this metaphorical use is found in a statement by Meister Eckhart, cited on several occasions by Jung. and you'll see why. Therefore do I turn back once more to myself. There do I find the deepest places, deeper than hell itself. For even from there does my wretchedness drive me. Nowhere can I escape myself. Here I'll set me down, and here I will remain. The self as deeper than hell. Within the context of the decline of the belief in a literal hell, two figures stand out. Emanuel Swedenborg. In terms of central precision and graphic detail, it's only perhaps Swedenborg's hell which comes close to matching Dante's. Swedenborg, a Swedish scientist and Christian mystic, underwent a religious crisis in the 1740s, depicted in his Journal of Dreams. In 1745, he was sitting in a tavern in London and heard a stranger say, "Don't eat so much." He went back home, and that night the stranger appeared in a dream and revealed himself as Christ, and told him that he would travel through heaven and hell and talk with demons and angels and dead and show people the true faith. He was told to note what he'd seen and heard and demonstrate the symbolic meaning of the Bible, which he duly did. In Swedenborg's work, Heaven and Hell were presented as strictly dichotomous. All things in accord with the divine order corresponded to heaven, and all contrary things to hell. In hell, the spirits of the dead continue their lives much as they did on earth. The main thesis of Swedenborg's work is encapsulated in his statement, "Heaven and hell are from the human race." Within each of us, there were two gates, one which was open to evil and to hell, the other to good and to heaven. What characterized those who are currently in hell was that when they were living in the world, they loved the flesh, the self, and the world, as opposed to the soul, the love of the Lord, and the love of the neighbor. Now, how did one get to hell? Swedenborg presents its geography. Hells were to be found under mountains, hills, and rocks, and their opening appeared like holes and clefts. Some of the hells appeared to the view like the dens and caves of wild beasts in the forests. Some were like the hollow caverns and passages that are seen in mines. Some hells present an appearance like the ruins of houses and cities after conflagrations. In some hells, there were nothing but brothels. There are also deserts where all is barren and sandy. Hence, there was a multiplicity of hells. One didn't see them by walking by them because a light only flashed when a soul was cast into hell. Then one had some smoke coming up. So against the common belief that there was one hell which was the same for everyone, Swedenborg noted that there was an infinite variety and diversity. In a similar manner to Dante, Swedenborg not only presents a vision of hell, but also a hermeneutics, a spiritual hermeneutics. The Bible had two levels of meaning, a physical, literal level and an inner spiritual one. These were linked by the doctrine of correspondences. So I'll come back later to this notion of, in the visionary tradition, of a linkage between a vision encapsulating its own hermeneutics. The most acute reader of Swedenborg was William Blake. From his youth, this is a self-portrait. From his youth, Blake had visions of angels and historical figures whom he conversed with. And for a time, indeed, he joined the Swedenborgian Church in London, where it was established. Blake became critical of the institutionalization of Swedenborgianism and began taking a more critical view of Swedenborg. Around 1890, he published a work, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. In The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, Blake articulated his critique of Swedenborg. Indeed, the very title, Marriage of Heaven and Hell, encapsulated his sense that these were not two radically dichotomous and distinct locations. Swedenborg's problem, he noted, was that he'd conversed only with angels and not with the devils who hated religion. He'd had the wrong informants. If you want to know what hell is like, you've got to talk to a devil. I mean, it's perfectly obvious. What Swedenborg had failed to see, Blake noted his annotations to Swedenborg, was that heaven and hell are born together. He articulated a notion of dynamic oppositions. What is basic is a series of contraries: attraction and repulsion, reason and energy, love and hate. And these oppositions were necessary for life. What religions called good and evil were secondary terms, derivatives, which sprang from these basic series of contraries. They were not primary. At the same time, Blake then launched a critique of organized religion. And of Swedenborg, he noted, he'd done much good and will do much good. He's corrected many errors of popery and also of Luther and Calvin, but there was little that was genuinely new in his work, and it ultimately served orthodox belief, despite its protestations to the contrary. It was Dante that Blake considered the greater figure, and his last years he produced a series of engravings to the Commedia of watercolors. That's Lucifer, in case you didn't recognize him. This by way of backdrop. We turn now to Jung. You have noticed that I've not mentioned Freud. As Eugene Taylor and I have been arguing for decades, Freudocentric legend of the genesis of Jung's psychology, namely that its origins lay first in Jung's discipleship and then divergence from Freud, has led to the complete mislocation of Jung in the intellectual history of the 20th century. That's the postcard version. It's only since October the 7th that the full extent of this has finally emerged into the public domain with the publication of Liber Novus. I would contend that to continue to argue that psychoanalysis is the key determining context for the emergence of Jung's psychology can henceforth only be regarded as acts of willful obscurantism. In no way does Liber Novus emerge as the sequelae of Jung's divergence from Freud, as if it's enough to diverge from Freud and enter this vast visionary domain. Rather, it should be located and situated within the context of the visionary tradition. For what Liber Novus presents us with is a way back to hell. A hell that was increasingly lost to the Western imagination. As noted, between the autumn of 1913 and the summer of 1914, Jung engaged in a lengthy period of self-experimentation, inducing fantasies in a waking state. Uncertain of his activities till the outbreak of war convinced him that his fantasies were precognitive. He then wrote a handwritten manuscript of 1,000 pages, adding a second layer of lyrical elaboration, interpretation, and commentary. He then had this typed and retranscribed it into the volume we have upstairs. This was self-styled as a prophetic work. Der Weg des Kommenden, the way of what is to come. Like Dante's vision of hell, like Swedenborg's vision, Jung's vision contains its hermeneutic within it. In this layer too, an attempt to elaborate the significance of his fantasies. Thus, like Dante, Swedenborg, and Blake, Jung's endeavor was not simply to elaborate a work born of visionary experience, to give it form, but to elaborate hermeneutics of how it should be read. In a critical sense, then, interpretive commentary is superfluous. What is required is a wider contextualization. This is the whole work approaching you. It's a new form of a Jungian optician's test. Now, in terms of the Western cultural tradition, not a little has been written on Jung's relation to figures in his pantheon, such as Goethe and in particular Nietzsche, but other figures have received scant attention, such as Dante, Swedenborg, and Blake. And I wish to speak a little bit of this now. In Jung's copy of the Commedia, there is a touching slip of paper inserted by the opening cantos in the line, "In the middle of the journey of our life, I found myself astray in a dark wood, where the straight road had been lost sight of." This was the situation where Jung found himself. In a lecture at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in 1935, Jung noted, "A point exists at about the 35th year when things begin to change. It's the first moment of the shadow side of life and of the going down to death. It's clear that Dante found this point, and those who've read Zarathustra will know that Nietzsche also discovered it. When this turning point comes, people meet it in several ways. Some turn away from it, others plunge into it, and something important happens to yet others from the outside. We do not see a thing, fate does it to us." It's clear from this that Jung found an existential as well as a literary prototype for his activity in the Commedia. And there are indications that Jung was reading the Commedia during this period. On 26 December 1913, he transcribed the following lines from the Purgatorio into his Black Book. Quote, "And I to him, I am one who, when love breathes on me, notices, and in the manner that he dictates within, I utter words." Second quote, "And then, in the same manner as a flame, which follows the fire, whatever shape it takes, the new form follows the spirit exactly." It seems to me these citations give voice to Jung's undertaking. They give expression to what he was endeavoring to do. In the manner that he dictates within, I utter words. He was transcribing what he was hearing in a faithful manner. And second, the new form follows the spirit exactly. This is his fidelity to the event. This is what he was attempting to bear witness to. In his published scholarly writings, Jung read the Commedia as a visionary experience disguised under historical and mythical events. Its significance for Jung as a historical document is found in his commentary in Psychological Types in 1921. He argued that the birth of modern individualism began when with the worship of women, quote, "which strengthened man's soul very considerably as a psychological factor, since the worship of women meant worship of the soul. This is nowhere more beautifully and perfectly expressed than in Dante's Divine Comedy." So he situates it right at the birth of modern individualism, the worship of the soul. Jung then goes on to comment on several cantos from Paradiso, St. Bernard's prayer to the Virgin Mother. I turn now to Swedenborg. First, to highlight the significance of Swedenborg for Jung was Eugene Taylor, who's lurking somewhere there. So address all questions on Swedenborg to him. In his youth, Jung read through many volumes of Swedenborg. Though not directly cited, Swedenborg features critically in the backdrop to Liber Novus. The very beginning of the text, Jung's turning away from the things of the world to the soul, can be seen as parallel to Swedenborg's conception of heaven and hell. The turning inward, the turning away, that what he'd previously lived had been a hell, in the sense, a negation of the soul. There are also many similarities in the manner in which Swedenborg engaged, dialogued, and attempted to be instructed by figures in the spiritual world and Jung's endeavor in Liber Novus. The critical difference is simply one of ontology. Jung replaces Swedenborg's spiritual realism with psychic realism, his notion of esse and anima, articulated indeed in Liber Novus and then in Psychological Types. It's simply a shift of ontology, a different manner of reading Swedenborg. Swedenborg's spiritual hermeneutics, reading the symbolic sense of the Bible, also appears to inform the hermeneutics of Layer 2 of Liber Novus. Jung's relation to the works of Blake appears to be more ambivalent and oscillates, and this appears to be connected to Jung's ambivalence concerning the notion of art. In 1921, Jung cited Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell in Psychological Types, which indicates that he read it during this period when he was working on Liber Novus. Now, a curious thing about Psychological Types is the most read chapter has been the definition of types at the end, but it's to me quite apparent that the most important chapter of the text is chapter 5, the type problem in poetry, and the reading of Psychological Types will be, in a way, completely transformed after reading Liber Novus. And the significance of this chapter will be apparent in the sense that he's transposing or attempting to cast in a conceptual language some of the insights of Liber Novus. At the end of this, I say at the end of what I consider the most important chapter of the work, Jung cites Blake's statement from Heaven and Hell that there were two classes of men, the prolific and the devouring, and that religion was an attempt to reconcile the two. Jung then noted that this summarized the whole of his previous discussion. So that just says it all. Quite striking. In 1930, in a discussion of visionary works of art, Jung noted that poets turned to mythological figures to give suitable expression to their experience. This did not mean that they were working with second-hand material, but it was the only way to give form to imageless primordial experience. So one starts with imageless primordial experience, authentic visionary experience, which then poets use mythological and historical figures to give form to. They've derived the figures from somewhere, but that does not mean that the visions themselves are derived from elsewhere. An important point to note in discussions of Liber Novus. Jung then noted, Dante decks out his experience in all the imagery of heaven and purgatory and hell. Blake presses into his service the phantasmagoric world of India, the Old Testament, and the Apocalypse. So in his view here, Blake's work contained visions from the collective unconscious, clothed in mythological language. In 1939, in Jung's introduction to Suzuki's work on Zen Buddhism, Jung noted that the glimmerings of a breakthrough of total experience in the West were to be found in Goethe's Faust and Nietzsche's Zarathustra. Again, the usual suspects from Jung's pantheon. However, tucked away in a footnote, we find, quote, in this connection, I must also mention the English mystic, William Blake. In this connection. He can't not raise him to the levels of Goethe and Nietzsche. In 1944, in Psychology and Alchemy, Jung featured two images by Blake and one of his illustrations to Dante. The legend in Psychology and Alchemy describes this as the soul as a guide showing the way. It's actually a revealing slip. It's actually Dante and Virgil ascending the mountain of purgatory. In a 1948 letter, he noted, "I find Blake a tantalizing study, since he has compiled a lot of half or undigested knowledge in his fantasies. According to my idea, they are an artistic production rather than an authentic representation of unconscious processes." Here again, you find instances of this oscillation. It seems to me, as I was indicating, this oscillation concerns Jung's own ambivalence concerning his own work. Was Liber Novus a work of art? The notion of the dynamic interplay of contraries, central to Blake's Heaven and Hell, is a key theme in Jung's Liber Novus, though there's no evidence to suggest that he derived this idea from Blake. Rather, it's indicative of what Jung may have found tantalizing in the reading and study of Blake. Around 1910, Jung went on a sailing trip with his friends Albert Ury and Andreas Vischer, during which Ury read out chapters from the Odyssey dealing with Circe and the Nakia. Jung noted that shortly afterwards, he, like Odysseus, was presented by fate with a Nakia, the descent into the dark Hades. This is then Jung's figuration of his self-experimentation, a descent into the underworld. I'd like now to briefly trace this motif. On the 21st December of 1913, in his fantasy, at the outset of his journey, in which he first encountered the biblical figures of Salome and Elijah, Jung gazes into a stone and catches sight of Odysseus and his journey on the high seas, one of the first figures that he encounters. After his interchange with Salome and Elijah, he looks again into this stone, thinking again of Odysseus and how he passed the rocky islands of the Sirens, and wonders if he should do so or not. He is there imagining himself in the same situation. In his commentary in the Layer 2 hermeneutics on this passage, you noted that the image indicated that lengthy wanderings lay ahead of him. Odysseus had gone astray when he had played his trick at Troy. Then Jung notes, Odysseus would not have become what he was without his Odyssey. So it's the question of the necessity of the wandering, of the erring, in terms of his becoming. In the handwritten draft to the second book of Liber Novus, Liber Secundus, Jung subtitled Liber Secundus, The Adventures of the Odyssey. In the corrected draft, this is retitled The Great Odyssey. And finally, Jung suggested the line from the Odyssey, happily escaped from the jaws of death, be used as a motto for Aniele Jaffe's biography of him, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, still misleadingly referred to as his autobiography. I come now to the descent into hell. It was a few weeks earlier, on December 12th, that he engaged in his first visual fantasy. In 1925, in a seminar, he recalled, I devised such a boring method by fantasizing that I was digging a hole. The fantasy then begins, I see a grey rock along which I sink into great depths. This is a sensible procedure for anyone versed in Swedenborg. It's digging a hole in the rocks. That is where hell is to be found. The fantasy that ensues, Jung saw a killed figure float by on a stream, and serpents who veiled the sun, from which a stream of blood flowed. In 1914, as noted, Jung felt that these visions, these fantasies, were precognitive. And he then titles this chapter, Descent into Hell in the Future. In his fantasy, he had descended into hell, and the bloodshed that he saw depicted what was happening in Europe. Quote, "As the darkness seized the world, a terrible war arose, and the darkness destroyed the light of the world, since it was incomprehensible to the darkness and good for nothing anymore. And so we had to taste hell. Hell was now indeed let loose. It was the earth, the bloodshed and the slaughter of the Great War. The world had gone literally to hell." But critically, in Jung's account in Liber Novus, this was not senseless, but meaningful for the further development of mankind. I'd like to indicate further depictions of Jung's imagination of hell in Liber Novus. On 12th January, he found himself in a gloomy vault with a tangle of human bodies. He realized then that he had reached the underworld, or hell. On 18th January 1914, after he'd been interred in the insane asylum that James Billington mentioned, he found himself in a steamer. His neighbor in the ward, a fool who declared himself to be Nietzsche and Christ, told him simply that they were in hell. On 2nd February 1914, his serpent soul tells him that they had arrived in hell. He saw a hanged man who'd poisoned his parents and his wife. The man tells him that he'd done this to honor God, so to escape the wretchedness of life for a state of eternal blessedness. In a fantasy of 28th December 1913, he found himself in a castle in the forest where he met an old scholar. He's led to a room to sleep and imagines that the scholar has locked up his daughter, which seems to be a hackneyed theme for a romantic novel. She then literally appeared before him. And Jung notes, "I am truly in hell, the worst awakening after death, to be resurrected in a lending library." I note that the Library of Congress is not a lending library, I think, perhaps for some members of Congress. "Have I held the men of my time and their taste in such contempt that I must live in hell and write out the novels that I've already spat on long ago? Does the lower half of average human taste also claim holiness and invulnerability, so we might not say any bad word about it without having to atone for the sin in hell?" So the canonical notion of the fitting punishment in hell is articulated here. He despised such novels, so he finds himself condemned to literally be in one, forced to live them out. The contemporary equivalent would no doubt be finding his work featured in a New York Times article or a TV cop show. Reflecting on this episode, Jung noted, "Your hell is made up of all the things that you always ejected from your sanctuary with a curse and a kick of the foot." What was required then was to give due attention to what led one to contempt and rage. And through accepting this, through accepting what one had rejected, one redeemed one's own other into life. Hence, the notion of going to hell is seen as essential in affirming the fullness of one's existence, and indeed of life itself. Life affirmation required an affirmation and an acceptance of hell. Hell epitomized the state that Jung found himself in, a moment of collapse of all that he cherished, all that he'd striven for, all that he aspired to and held dear, transvaluation of all his values. And he comments as follows, "What do you think of the essence of hell? Hell is when the depths come to you with all that you are no longer, I'll start again. What do you think of the essence of hell? Hell is when the depths come to you with all that you no longer are or are not yet capable of. Hell is when you can no longer attain what you could attain. Hell is when you must think and feel and do everything that you know you do not want. Hell is when you know that your having to is also a wanting to, and that you yourself are responsible for it. Hell is when you know that everything serious that you've planned with yourself is also laughable, that everything fine is also brutal, that everything good is also bad, that everything high is also low, that everything pleasant is also shameful. A complete moment of reversal, the Eckartian sense of the return to oneself as deeper than hell itself, or indeed the deepest hell. And Jung notes, but the deepest hell is when you realize that hell is also no hell, but a cheerful heaven, not a heaven in itself, but in this respect a heaven, and in that respect a hell. This is indeed what Blake would have called the marriage of heaven and hell. What then does one do when one finds oneself in hell in life? Jung found a prototype in Christ's descent into hell, the harrowing of hell. One of the key themes in Liber Novus is that of the invitation of Christ. How was this to be understood? How was this to be lived? In reflecting upon this, Jung understood it not on a literal level, but in this deeper sense of living one's life as fully as Christ lived his. In attempting to do this, he had experienced something akin to Christ's descent into hell. Quote, "No one knows what happened during the 3 days Christ was in hell. I have experienced it. The men of yore said that he preached there to the deceased. What they say is true, but do you know how this happened? It was folly and monkey business, atrocious hell's masquerade, the holiest mysteries. How else could Christ have saved his Antichrist? Read the unknown books of the ancients, and you will learn much from them. Notice that Christ did not remain in hell, but rose to the heights in the beyond. In Jung's understanding, Christ's journey to hell was necessary. Without this, he would not have been able to ascend to heaven. In Jung's account in Liber Novus, Christ had to become his Antichrist, his underworldly brother. He had to become hell himself. Christ's task of the redemption, the salvation of the dead, is then taken up in what I call Jung's theology of the dead in Liber Novus. To cite one of the statements from the draft, quote, "Not one title of Christian law is abrogated, but instead we are adding a new one, accepting the lament of the dead." In Jung's theology of the dead, redemption does not take the form of literally saving the souls of the dead, but of taking on their legacy, answering their unanswered questions. After his work on Liber Novus, in his published scholarly writings, Jung attempted to translate some of the insights of Liber Novus to a language acceptable to a medico-scientific audience. One aspect of this undertaking was a psychological formulation and interpretation of Christ's descent into hell. In 1937, in his Terry lectures at Yale, Jung noted, 3 days' descent into hell during death describes the sinking of the vanished value into the unconscious, where by conquering the power of darkness, establishes a new order, then rises up to heaven again, that is, attains supreme clarity of consciousness. I'll read this again. You hear the change in language. The 3 days' descent into hell during death describes the sinking of the vanished value into the unconscious, where by conquering the power of darkness it establishes a new order, then rises up to heaven again, that is, attains supreme clarity of consciousness. In 1952, in Ion, he noted, "The scope of the integration is suggested by the descensus ad infernos, the descent of Christ's soul to heaven, to hell, whose work of redemption also encompasses the dead. The psychological equivalent of this forms the integration of the collective unconscious, which represents an essential part of the individuation process." Again, I repeat, the scope of the integration is suggested by the descensus ad infernos, the descent of Christ's soul to hell. Its work of redemption also encompasses the dead. The psychological equivalent of this forms the integration of the collective unconscious, which represents an essential part of the individuation process. Here we find Christ's descent into hell interpreted as the individuation process and the integration of the collective unconscious, the central theme in Jung's later work. But we must pause here. Which language, which articulation is primary? First-person voice in articulation in Liber Novus, or its subsequent reformulation decades later in the psychological concepts of the collected works? Relevant here are some comments that Jung made following a discussion of none other than Swedenborg. See, this talk does tie in some loose manner. At a discussion psychological club in the 1950s. I quote, "There are also visions whose pathological character can be recognized not from their form, but from their effects, or also that they subsequently require continual working. For instance, Niklaus von der Flue. He had a terrible vision and had to protect himself from it. Reinterpretation of the vision in the image of the Holy Trinity. Same with Swedenborg. He went up into this doctrinairness to protect himself against the vision, since this was dangerous for him. He hitched himself to the concepts. One must also give the patient something with which he can hold on to himself, which he can grasp, equals concepts. The visions of Swedenborg are something terribly important. Also with him a danger is shown that he plunged into the abyss. Because of that, he had to hold on to concepts. These form a true salvation for many men." A very nuanced statement. Jung is saying that Swedenborg, to protect himself, formed concepts. But Jung is not merely being critical and indicating for many men, concepts was all they would have to hold on to be able to withstand the experiences in question. Now this raises the question whether Jung's later conceptual system, which in some of his followers has not lacked for doctrinairness, forms such a safety net or guardrail, vital for some, no doubt, but a protection which may block access to the very experiences in question. Taking this further, does Jung's significance lie in his conceptual formulations, the individuation process, the collective unconscious, the integration of the collective unconscious, archetypes and so forth? Or rather, does it, in the terms of his own visionary experience, lie in the recovery of hell, as made accessible through individual fantasy, through individual vision, and enabling a new route to hell and back? If, as Jung claimed, Dante and Blake clothed visionary experience in mythological forms, could we not pose the question that Jung in turn attempted to clothe visionary experience in conceptual psychological forms? If so, the power and significance of his work does not reside in his concepts, which are familiar to us, but in the visionary experience which was at the back of them. Publication of Liber Novus, then, finally enables one to reconsider Jung's significance in a wholly new, yet quintessentially ancient manner as Recovering the Road to Hell. Thank you.
Sonu, thank you. For 13 years, Sonu carried his knowledge of the Red Book in his head, keeping it confidential in all that time. And he had the good fortune to meet Jim Mayers at the library, there's so many Jims, at W.W. Norton, who was the editor. Unfortunately, he's not here today. And Norton originally planned a publication of 5,000 volumes. They thought they might sell between 1,500 and 2,000. And now the book has gone through its 6th printing with 45,000 volumes sold in English, 10,000 in German, a Portuguese edition coming out in the fall, and many more languages will be added to the versions of the Red Book. So that book is going to be on the shelves of many lending libraries. Sorry, Jung. But it's, again, another example of how an idea and an imagination can bring forth such a phenomenon. So thank you so much. I know from Sonu that one of his intentions was to make this material available to those who had toiled in the tradition of Jung for many years, and his feeling that people who had devoted their lives to this enterprise really deserved to have access to this material. And no one deserved it more than James Hillman, who is our next speaker. James is probably the most eminent of all of Jungian analyst scholars, and the founder of archetypal psychology. He was born in this country and attended the Sorbonne in Paris and graduated from Trinity College, Dublin. He received his Ph.D. from the University of Zurich, and he was also received his analyst diplomat from the Jung Institute there. He was the director of studies at that institute until 1969, and that was the year that we arrived in Zurich and met James Hillman. He then founded Spring House and Spring Publications and has certainly more than 15 volumes in his name. Revisioning Psychology, The Soul's Code in Search of Character and Calling, and many other volumes. And right now, a 10-volume uniform edition of Archetypal Psychology is being produced, and it's collecting many of his works. And the 6th one, which is Alchemical Psychology, is now in press, and I believe it will be out in the fall. Others, City and Soul, Senex and Puer, I believe have already been published. So the uniform edition of Archetypal Psychology will be available. And meanwhile, here is the man in whose head it all exists, James Hillman.
Thank you very much, Beverly, and thank you, Sonu. The title that I gave my thoughts this morning is Jung and the Profoundly Personal. And so it seemed probably a good move in old age to make it profoundly personal. Not only about Jung's profoundly personal, but maybe something from my own past. But first, I want to quote something from Auden, Wystan Auden, the poet. "We are lived by powers we pretend to understand." And that's the whole thing. And the work that Sonu has been doing, the work that Jung did, what that book is, and what Jung spent his life trying to write and make clear, is the pretending to understand, trying to understand the powers. And we are always up against the enormous limitations of the mind and of language in attempting to understand the powers that are living us. And once we enter the realization that we are being lived, we are not the sole agents. The ego is a myth, a figure. I've never met one anywhere, except the word somewhere or another. That all of that is attempts to understand the powers. And this changes the way one imagines what's going on in life and what happens in relationships, what happens in therapy, what happens everywhere else. We are being lived by powers we pretend to understand. Of course, I never understood this, still don't fully, but feel it. And this is June 2010. In June 1961, I was then 35, and I was allowed to go out to Jung's house and pay homage to Jung's body. He was in a separate room, and some of us went out to Küsnacht from Zurich. I remember carrying a lily, one of those huge lilies with white, those exquisite things that you see imaged in Psychology and Alchemy, and being received beautifully by Frau Lilly Jung, Frau Hörny, Frau Gret Baumann, and we sat on the sofa sometimes, different people coming and going, and I looked at photographs from the old days, and we were beautifully received at this time of mourning. So it was probably the second or third day, I don't know exactly. And so I had my moment in the room with the body and paid homage, had my lily. And the message, the meaning that I was given was get out or get on or gets over, something like that, and do my work. Now, after that, interesting that lily, because I remember Yolanda Jacobi, a member of that group at that time, brought red roses. I brought the anima image of the lily. I was the young man of 35 who was anima possessed by the idea of the soul, the softness, the adulation, all of those virtues that the lily was. But the message was, get out, get on, get over, and do my work. And that was the truth. So then for years and years and years and years, it seems to me, I was doing the work. And at the same time, I was undoing the work. And I was living the tension that Sonu Shamdasani spoke of last night, the tension between the public and the private. Now, I have reached that or resolved that tension for a moment by telling that story, by telling a story that is public or telling a story in public that is intimately private. And Jung's The Red Book is a book of deep, deep, intimate privateness. So of course there's this tension. What part is public? What part is private? How far do you go with this or with that? Of course, in late life, it's resolved. The whole business becomes what's public and what's private anyway. And what difference does it really make? We are all scandals. But each differently, of course. So that tension of doing and undoing, the tension between undoing the language that Sonu has been speaking about, these words that obsess our attempt to understand, ego, unconscious, this kind of type and that kind of type, these rational words that are left over from psychology of other periods, psychology of other dimensions, psychologies of other psychologists. Jung's own language was not that. That's what the Red Book, when it came out, was like an enormous turn for me, a revelation that my undoing all these years of trying to work through and resist this language of opposites. You used the word contraries. Contraries are not opposites, they're necessary to each other. They're co-relative, coexistent. You don't have one without the other. Black and white aren't opposites. They are only opposites if your mind has to think in an Aristotelian way and put them into the category of opposites. Otherwise, you can have all sorts of whiteness without thinking about black, and you can have all sorts of blackness without any kind of necessary opposition. There are no white berries, there's no white coal, there's no, I mean, these are necessary, these are mistakes in thinking. And it was that struggle all along that has occupied me, but now with the Red Book, there is the revelation that the language of psychology is imagistic, it's poetic, it is pre-dialectic, pre-logical. Jung writes those sentences that seem sometimes to be forgotten in the psychological types which you mentioned as being so crucial, and as the book that I think that's the first book that came out after the beginnings of the experience with Liber Novus. Am I right about that? 1921, I think? Yeah. He says, image is not a psychic reflection of an external object. It's not because you saw something and then you have an image of it, but a concept derived from poetic usage. Poetic usage is the beginning of the right language for psychology, if we're talking about the powers that have us. A fantasy image, and they appear in space and as voice, but are not pathological as such. He writes, and I'll give you even the paragraph numbers. Paragraph 722 in psychological types. Imagination is the reproductive or creative activity of the mind in general. What does the mind do? It doesn't invent words like ego. It invents imaginative forms, figures, melodies, poetic phrases, moments of insight, intuitions, formula. Imagination is the reproductive or creative activity of the mind in general. Fantasy, as imaginative activity, is the direct expression of psychic life. What does the psyche do naturally? As a chicken naturally lays an egg, the human psyche fantasizes. That's its primary activity. Our dreams are prior to our thinking. See, this is a way of looking at the world that seems to me to have been realized in Jung's life in the Red Book. That is, the concession of the mind that goes back to Aristotle but gets reinforced particularly from Descartes onward, the rational mind, the mind that was dominating that 18th century in which Blake and Swedenborg were contraries, that mind doesn't do the job, and that psychology that arises from that mind can't do the job. So, of course, everyone's in therapy because they're using the wrong mind to deal with the psyche. And the therapists are using the wrong mind in dealing with the psyches who are using the wrong mind. The mind is creating images, fantasies, and that these are living realities that can speak to us. They come figured at times, not only, as I say, also a melody is a psychic image. Fantasy as imaginative activity is the direct expression of psychic life. And they are identical with, again Jung's quote, with the flow of psychic energy. So our energy, our emotional vitality, whichever way it goes, down or up, inward or outward, the psychic energy is actually only one aspect. The other aspect are the fantasy figures and forms. So if you want to get hold of your emotions, or know what emotion, or feel yourself trapped by an emotion, you try to find the image of that emotion, which tells you much more about the emotion than simply suffering the emotion itself. It isn't to get out of the emotion, it is to find its form, to find its fantasy, to elaborate it further. Identical with the flow of psychic energy. Even more, he says, in Psychological Types, paragraph 78, this one. Psyche creates reality every day. The only expression I can use for this activity is fantasy. Wow. Psyche creates reality every day. We think there's psychic inner world, and then there's reality. Watch out, don't do that. Psychic reality, and then reality, hard reality, which is always hard, tough, real, cold, and so on. Well, that reality is a fantasy also. It's only not recognized as a fantasy, and so we call it reality. Whatever we call reality is a fantasy that has got stubborn and blocked and become obscured to the fact of the flow of psychic energy in it. This opens the whole business. This opens the soul to living, so that, there's a line from Soroy in one of his plays, two people meet, and one says to the other, "What's the fantasy now, Kitty Duval?" That's the relationship. What's the fantasy now? Not what happened to you when you were 4. That's a fantasy too, what happened to you when you were 4. Now, what I'm trying to elaborate is also that it is profoundly personal. We think the profoundly personal is what happened to us when we were 4. The wounds we've suffered, the hopes that were dashed, the relationships that we have or had, the intimacies, the memories, that this is the profoundly personal. But these are the things that happen to everybody. Everyone has been jilted. Everyone has been disappointed. Everyone has filled with enthusiasm. These are the profoundly collective experiences. The profoundly personal is the engagement with one's own demons, or the visit to hell. And the encounter with the figures that Jung had. This is the most intimate, deep, profound, unexpected, completely surprising, individualized part of life. In other words, the encounter with one's own soul. And the Red Book begins with that. Jung felt he had lost his soul, and it was now his job to find it, or to find out where it was or what had happened. This is the profoundly personal. Now, this changes a lot, because the entire realm of psychotherapy for 100 years has been going down the avenue of the profoundly personal is my personal life, my personal memories, my personal childhood, my personal experiences, my personal, the subjectivism of my, what Freud called the Tagesreste, or the personal unconscious, or the repressed. But there is something else that is not collective in that way, and not collective, let's say, that is not common to us all, but has some deep individual, fateful aspect. And this is what Jung was engaged with as I read the Red Book. He was engaged with uncovering what are in the depths of the soul that was given to him and the fate that was given to him. Now that changes what's important in your life. That changes that these things you're trying to work out in regard to your personal life are really being lived by powers we're trying to understand. And it takes a kind of courageous fiat mihi, let it be done to me, to drop into that. Again, in profoundly personal in my own case, when I got to Zurich in 1953, the terrors of what lurked that I didn't understand or was afraid of seemed to me to be down below. Now, I hadn't read about Jung's descent through the hole that he dug, but I had that feeling that there were things that were going to come up and get me. And I took to making little paintings of what might be down there, because this was encouraged by my analyst. That seemed to be the way you did things. And I recall the descent in my moment was into water. I went down deep into the bottom of the sea, and there were a lot of creatures there that were going to grab me and hold me and do things and so on. And I had the experience that I could breathe underwater. And that was a revelation. Whatever a revelation is, that seemed a revelation. That I could actually stay in this realm and do things, talk, ask questions, move around, explore, and breathe underwater. It was that literal and that concrete and that vivid, the being underwater. And yet at the same time, the imagination, the fantasy made it possible to breathe. Now, this is just one example of hundreds of examples of this kind of work that Jung invented. Invented because I say he invented it for modern psychology. People have been doing exploratory journeys forever. It's not, and they're recorded in all kinds of ways, in epics, in Dante's work, in Blake's work, and all the way back. All sorts of people have done Hildegard von Bingen and so on and so forth. That's not the point. The point is that Jung did something different with it. He devised this partly as a way, as a method, as something that can be recorded carefully and observed with a phenomenological mind. And I say a phenomenological mind rather than an empirical mind because he was not doing experiment only in the sense of let's try this and see what happens. He was allowing the phenomena to speak. And there's a difference between empiricism and phenomenology here, because the empiricist is also doing something with what is. And the phenomenologist is, first of all, allowing the phenomenon to have its say, and all thoughts about it, what it should be, how it should work, all the historical information is bracketed out, and you're left with simply the way the phenomenon appears. And Jung let the phenomena speak. Now, we need to know here how difficult it is to let them speak. In our culture, we must remember that, let me just, because I do have a note actually, I think it's Mark, the biblical Mark, and you'll be able to tell me. Jesus doesn't let Mark 1:34. Jesus suffered not the devils to speak. Now, do you realize by letting the demons speak, by letting the voices speak, Jung was making a move of demonology, as Karl Jaspers has said, and he was immediately being heretical, as his pastor said at his funeral, that he was a heretic. Well, it's very important because the heretics belong within the church. They're not simply heretics. They have a very important role. And so he let the demons speak. Mark 1:34 says, Jesus suffered not the devils to speak. Get thee behind me, Satan. Harrow hell, death wears thy sting. That opening produced a radical move in the relation of Jung to Christianity. And the voice says at times in the Red Book, the Christianity that he has is not, Sonu will be able to tell me those passages, where the Christianity that Jung thought he was a Christian is not the Christianity that he is discovering in the book. Is that more or less? Yeah. So that he says, and you can see why, because he is allowing other voices, the multitude of voices, to speak and to be figured, to be personified, to have as reality as other figures. In the basic fundamental Christian way of looking at it, there is only one voice that can speak to you, and that it must be Jesus' voice. So all the others are out of the game. So the images are also voices, and they bring some sort of message from the dead. And that was one of the things I'd love to talk more with you, Sonu, about, is who are the dead? Who are the dead in Jung's book? Are they his personal ancestors? Are they the dead of Jerusalem from the 7 sermons? Who are the dead? What is the message of the dead? And what is it in America, what is it in our culture that has so much trouble with the dead? So difficulty. Our president can't even go to the coffins of the dead, a former president. That we have this this tremendous wall between living and death, so that at any cost we must keep the living alive, because what's on the other side? No sense of the permeability of life and death, of the flow of the others, of the voices, of the figures, of the powers into our life every day, of our relation to those on the other side who, in the old days, used to say, welcome, to be welcomed by the ancestors when you die. Received. Instead, there's something, this great unknown, and you die alone, and all these horrors are imagined because there's no sense of the ancestors. And of course, our ancestors are the American Indians who lived in this soil. So perhaps our dead, we are cut from the dead by what we have buried. And to go to the dead would bring up all sorts of things we don't want to bring up. But it's a question that seems to me the dead are the daily encounter with everything that has been left out, buried, burned, drowned, forgotten on purpose, and continues to send wafts of little messages through all sorts of small intuitions, hunches, hints, warnings, omens, the little feelings in the stomach that say, no, I don't think I'll do that. I'm not going to pick up the phone on that one. Let that one go. Those little cautions and warning. Who sends those? Who's protecting us every day about not doing this or doing that? Remember, Socrates said that he was never told by his daimon what to do. He was only cautioned what not to do. Where does the what not to do? The moment of holding off, holding back, not. The moment of not. Are those the dead keeping us safe, watching out for us? Today, this book is so enormously, how many thousand? Could I have those figures again? What were they?
46,000 in English.
46,000 in English, 10,000.
And more languages coming.
And more languages coming. Imagine.
Another printing.
And another printing. We're in the 6th, imagine. On the bestseller list, imagine. Imagine. It was last week on Law and Order, Criminal Intent. If you happen to see, was that what it's called, Criminal Intent? If you happen to have seen it, the Red Book was displayed itself, and it was part of a cult. It was inspiring some, I don't know whether they were vampires or they were. Now, of course, it's been reviewed. You know, we've had meetings like this in New York and Los Angeles and the New York Times and so on and so forth. What is its importance in our culture at this moment? Is what I have been saying about the dead, about the voices, about letting the demons speak, about the deep polytheistic background that has been forgotten, about the depth of the profundity of one's personal life and its importance, and the individual search for, not for meaning, but for image, for images. Meanings don't carry you through, but the images are your companions. You can have all the slogans in the world and explanations and understandings, but what carries you through are the voices and figures you live with and can talk with. Is that what's missing? Is that what they call? It's so radically different from anything else in psychology, so radically different from today's cultural milieu of technology, economics, reason, information. You know, when the book first, I don't know if I'm going on too long, am I? Okay. When the book, when it was being written around 1915, let's say, just that period, at that time, current in the mind was Blavatsky, surrealism, parapsychology, worked on by leading intellects like William James and many others in England, Dadaism, German Expressionism, Joyce. There were compatible and comparable experiments in other areas. In our time, this book is absolutely freakish because we live in such a narrow, technical, rational, explanatory, causal way of thinking. We have shrunk our mindset tremendously since the beginning of the century, when this book was not as strange, in my mind, would not have been as strange. After all, Jung wrote his doctoral dissertation in the year 1900 on occult phenomena for a medical degree. Think of that in today's medicine. Today's medicine is packed with occult phenomena. So the book is sort of a necessity. The book is a necessity in our time, and it is recognized on a deep level of the collective psyche. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James. There is another James that I would like to thank, and he's just left the room, but I'm going to thank him anyway at this point. One of the groups of the dead that Jung met, as James Billington described to us, were the Anabaptists in the Red Book. And James Hudson, who has been the marvelous scholar and gentleman and head of the manuscripts division of the Library of Congress, is a historian, and one of his specialties has been the Anabaptists in terms of the history of the church. And working with him has been such a pleasure in the formation of this program. And he told me that he found out that the Swiss Anabaptists were tied in sacks by Zwingli in 1525. And Zwingli and his friends drowned them in the Lake of Zurich, not far from Küsnacht. So that when Jung met the ghosts of the Anabaptists, they were a group of dead that were emerging out of the waters. So, another wonderful backstory. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague from New York, Anne Belford-Ulinoff. Anne has been a strong womanly voice in Jungian studies for many decades. She holds the Christine Brooks Johnson Memorial Chair, established in memory of her student at New York's Union Theological Seminary, where she's a professor of psychiatry and religion. And she's also a Jungian analyst in private practice in Manhattan. Anne has many, many books to her credit, certainly 9 that I know of. And she is always at work. She's published many books of her own, and she published several with her husband, the late Barry Ulinoff. Her 2 recent titles are Spirit and Jung, The Unshuttered Heart, Opening to Aliveness and Deadness in the Self. So I'm so grateful that Anne is here with us today. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. In the Red Book, Jung encounters Elijah and Salome, who say to him, "We are real and not symbols." And they express the tone of the whole volume. What the guide Hillman conveys, psychic reality exists, it's there, it's objective, and addresses Jung in a series of images, figures, tasks. And though later, Jung reflects that these figures are personifications of unconscious thoughts, when he actually meets them, they are real experiences and evoke in him dread, loathing, confusion. He describes Salome as bloodthirsty horror, exclaiming, "I fear her." He understood Salome to personify his feeling, which he had scorned as grossly inferior to his thinking, personified by Elijah. And even later, when Salome is redeemed into loving and offers her love to Jung, he says to her, "You are like the serpent who coiled around me and pressed out my blood." And yet at the end of his encounters, he learns from Hillman that only through voluntary devotion to love do I arrive at my truest and innermost self. From this one of countless examples, we get a sense of what it is to read the Red Book. We plunge in, down, where encounters with the unconscious call us out, forcing us to tasks that if we avoid, we miss the boat. In painting 55, we see what Jung saw, that we all have a boat riding on the unconscious psyche, under which the serpent, the dragonfish, the monster Apophis swims, threatening to swallow the sun of consciousness. Jung was called to these encounters, forced by his own complexes that, when faced, yielded his vocation. He said, "In my 40th year of life, I had achieved everything that I had wished for myself," but he had lost his soul and had to go find it. With fright, he asks his soul, "Into what mist and darkness does your path lead? I limp after you on crutches of understanding. I follow, but it terrifies me." And yet Jung recognizes, quote, "This life is the way, the long sought-after way to the unfathomable divine," thus pairing psyche with soul, to whom he says, "Your meaning is a supreme meaning, and your steps are the steps of a god." Jung felt carried into fearsome territory beyond what Christ taught. The soul tells him, "If you marry the ordered to the chaos, you produce the divine child, the supreme meaning beyond meaning and meaninglessness. Christ taught God is love, but you should know that love is also terrible. Christ overcomes the temptation of the devil, but not the temptation of God to good and reason." Identification, then, with what we call the good is not going to work anymore, for the soul tells him, "Nothing will deliver you from disorder and meaninglessness, since this is the other half of the world." In response, Jung says, "I swayed between fear, defiance, and nausea." Jung sees that as Christ knew that he was the way, the truth, and the life, I know that chaos must come over men. For him who has seen the chaos, he knows that the bottom sways, for he has seen the order and disorder of the endless. In short, the soul tells him, life has no rules. That is its mystery. We enter then a world of encounters, which Jung insistently claims as his own, saying, don't ape me. You have your own mysteries. Go there, find them. Jung is encountered by many figures. His meetings lead him to take leave of, quote, science, that clever knower that imprisons the soul in a lightless cell, to find another kind of knowing pertaining to the child God he comes to serve, and to paradoxical over intellectual intelligence. The child God, who is, quote, beyond being split between opposites, whose simple will we cannot learn, for it can only become in you, brings an attitude without preconceptions of inexhaustible freshness. And from this uniting of opposites arises a third, quote, the supreme meaning, the symbol, passing over into a new creation. Here, the symbol takes on incarnate life. It's not hanging in the air, but acts as a solid bridge into daily life. For, as Jung writes, the divine wants to live with me. Further, this new meaning changes our grasp of how we understand. Quote, the spirit of the depths took my understanding and all my knowledge and placed them at the service of the paradoxical, the melting together of sense and nonsense, which produces the supreme meaning, the God yet to come. Jung, for example, encounters the uniting of below and above, the monstrous and devoted, the collective and individual, the divine and the human. And paradox also changes our relation to what we know. He no longer identifies with it, but says, I do not myself become the supreme meaning, but the symbol becomes in me, that it has its substance, and I have mine. And even further, Jung distinguishes God and the image of God, saying it is not the coming God himself, but the image which appears in the supreme meaning. Chaos thus unites with order, and the God image we perceive and form, on which we depend, can always be destroyed. How does Jung get here to these thoughts? Only by going through hell, which he says means to become hell oneself. And he describes it as full of frightful noise, shrieking voices, where he discovers the 1,000 serpents that want to devour the sun are also in me. I myself am the murdered and the murderer, the sacrificer and the sacrificed. The upwelling of blood streams out of me. From refusals of such consciousness flow collective depredations, manifest then in World War I, manifest now across our globe in the countless cruelties we do to each other. Jung says, men fall on their brothers with mighty weapons and bloody acts when they do not know that their brother is themselves. One way or another, the sacrifice will be made, unconsciously in barbarism against each other and against the earth, as Philemon asks, do men atone for the ox with the velvet eyes? Or do penance for the shiny ore? Your bloodthirsty tiger growls softly, while you, conscious only of your goodness, offer your human hand to me in greeting. And suddenly I felt a cruel hammer blow struck a nail into my temple. What then is the sacrifice? To sever our identification with what he calls our formations, such as the image of God, or what we hold supreme, for Jung at that time, science, or what we experience as our ruling principle, for Jung, his thinking. The expansion of our subjectivity accompanies our opening to reality that lies beyond our images of its center. The ruling principle in each of us is the hero who must be slain. He writes, "The heroic in you is the fact that you are ruled by the thought that this or that is good, the goal. Consequently, you sin against incapacity. But incapacity exists. No one should deny it or shout it down. When we succeed, quote, in making a god, our whole force has entered into this design. We desire to rise with the divine sun and become part of its magnificence. But then we are no more than hollow forms." He continues, "For our formation causes many good persons to bleed to death. When we lose our force to our formation, we try with unconscious cunning and power, demandingly to force others into following the God. By clinging to our formation, we push away anything opposite, and left unvalued, this incapacity, this inferior part, does not develop, but degrades into monstrous form. But Jung finds that, quote, "salvation comes to you from the discarded. Your son will arise from the swamps." And even more shocking, but the lowest in you is also the eye of evil that stares at you coldly and sucks your light down into the dark abyss. We need the help of evil to dissolve our formations, for we become bad in our goodness and do not know it. Hence, we must recognize, quote, our complicity in the act of evil, for evil has to be accepted and must have a share in our life. This jarring encounter with his lowest, what he later calls his shadow, issues in Jung haranguing against, quote, his inordinate ambition. "You don't work for humanity, you work for self-interest," he accuses. "You consume yourself in rage and speak in cold daggers. What is concealed in you I will drag into light. You should be a vessel of life, so kill your idols." Yet Jung also harangues his soul, who has brought him to these realizations, accusing her of stealing, quote, the gold, the sparkling light of the jewel, and absconding with it to heaven. Jung insists that she tell him, "What is this treasure?" and give him what belongs to me, and beg for what you need from it. The soul finally confesses, it is love, warm human love, warm red blood, the holy source of life, the unification of everything separated and longed for. Jung protests, "You get drunk on the blood of man and let him starve. Love belongs to me. I want to love, not you through me." He insists she learn to honor mankind, because you force us to labor for your salvation. And now she must work for, quote, the earthly fortune of humankind. This means taking back into the human interior not just his own lowest, his inferior part, but also his force that creates the gods, not just his shadow, but also his now redeemed feeling, the treasure of warm human love, and not just his personal matter, but what his encounters show him about what matters, the fundamental elements of reality. For example, Jung must embrace, quote, the serpent of God that wants human blood. For this serpent life is part of the power that is different from the power of science. The serpent is the earthly essence of man, which is not conscious. It is the mystery that flows to us from the nourishing Earth Mother, from which everything that becomes emerges. It both causes Jung to become enslaved to his ruling principle, and hence is an adversary, but also gives him wisdom, hardness, a wise bridge that connects the right and the left and leads to concretization on earth. The point here is not theory, but making a difference in life, in ethical action. Jung does unite with the serpent. He says, I took my part of the humiliation and subjugation upon myself. And he continues, the devil, who is the sum of darkness of human nature, now has no power over him. For Satan is the quintessence of evil, pure negation without force. Taking on the serpent, Jung fetters the devil and builds, quote, a firm structure that can withstand the fluctuations of the personal, and therefore the immortal in me is saved. The dead come back to Jung because their unlived life drove them to find the animal part they had failed to live. Jung says he takes over something of the dead into my day, and death that can never be canceled out gives me durability and stability when I recognize the demands of the dead in me and satisfied them. I sacrificed personal striving in the world, which then took me for dead. But the serpent says to him, life is yet to begin, which Jung himself perceives in saying, the everyday belongs to the image of the Godhead. Echoing the words of Salome and Elijah that they are real, the everyday living serves the image we have of the ultimate, what we call God. And for this task of living the divine in every day, Jung has the help of the Kabiri, who grow from the flowers of the corpse of the slain dragon who devoured the sun of consciousness. Jung calls them possessors of ridiculous wisdom, first formations of the unformed gold. They have their origin in the lowest, and he asks them, are you the earthly feet of the Godhead? They say, we are the juices, sucked out of inertia, affixed to what is growing. We carry up what is dead, yet enters into the living. We placed stone on stone, and now you stand on solid ground. And they give him a sword to slay them. For that will free Jung from his entanglement with his formations, his ruling principle, his scientific thinking. So from this encounter we learn what Jung learned. Destructiveness finds its ongoing place in life. He writes, "The creating of the new prepares the destruction of precisely this day in the hope of leading it over into a new creation." As a result of these encounters, Jung experiences a change in his subjectivity. He says, "I'm smelted anew in the connection with the primordial beginning of myself and the world. The formed in him dissolves, binds itself anew with the children of chaos, the powers of darkness, the ruling and seducing, the divine and the devilish." He writes, "By accepting the lowest in myself, I lower a seed into the ground of hell. The seed is invisibly small, but the tree of life grows from it and conjoins the below and the above, beginning down where nothingness widens itself into unrestricted freedom." So in effect, the nowhere in us becomes the site of transcendence, for God is not now to be found in the absolute, but in the terrible ambiguity, quote, "the hateful beautiful, the sick healthy. The new God will be found in the relative, born as a child from my own soul and from the human soul, from the secret mystery of the individual." The arrival of the new comes not then as a descent of spirit from above, but from the below of matter, which for the psyche is the unconscious, that includes our personal narrative, but also the human narrative, the objective elements that must conjoin. We must do the work. Jung says, "When God enters my life, I bear the burden of poverty and everything reprehensible in me. With this I prepare the way for God's coming." This is not hubris, this is service. And a bold way Jung describes his service is this: the depths will force you into the mysteries of Christ. One is not redeemed through the hero, but becoming a Christ himself. We undergo the mysteries of conjoining the opposites and suffer what this conjunction brings. For Jung, it was conjoining thinking with feeling, science with magic, intellect with paradox, devil with God. And his way makes us ask, well, what is our way? And Jung writes, "You make yourself into the vessel of creation in which the opposites reconcile, and thus you also serve others. If we are ourselves," he writes, "we fulfill the need of the self, and through this become aware of the needs of the communal and can fulfill them. Then the life of God begins. May each one seek his own way. The way leads to mutual love and community." The change in his subjectivity accompanies the change in God images. The child, Christ, and Abraxas all turn up in Philemon's garden. Philemon tells Jung the dead rejected the God of love and the community of love. So I am teaching the God who blasts everything human, who powerfully creates and mightily destroys. And Philemon advises Jung to enter ever deeper into God, and Jung encounters the Lord of the Frogs, quote, "of bodily juices, the spirit of sperm and entrails, of the genitals, of the joints, of the nerves and the brain, the spirit of sputum and excretions." Abraxas, the name given to this God behind the Godhead, is, quote, the creative drive, form and formation, sheer effectiveness that unites the fullness and vital force, God, with the sucking gorge of emptiness, the devil. Abraxas who produces truth and lying, good and evil, life and death in the same word and in the same act is terrible. Out of the pleroma, which is fullness and nothing, the beginning and end of creation, quote, our nature, our very nature is differentiation. If we are true to our essence, we differentiate, and quote, the primordial creator of the world, the blind creative libido, becomes transformed in man through individuation, and out of this process arises a divine child, a reborn God, no more dispersed, but one, an individual, in all individuals, the same everywhere. A thread winds back to Christ, that we should be ourselves as truly as Christ was. Philemon says to Christ, what one individual can do for men, you have done. The time has come when each of us must do his own work of redemption. And Jung responds, I decided to do what was required of me. I accepted all the joy and every torment of my nature and remained true to my love, to suffer what comes to everyone in their own way. So behind the work of individuation lurks the terrific power of Abraxas, the sheer force of being. And as man becomes differentiated, at a great distance, writes Jung, in the zenith stands a star. This is the one God of this one man. This is his world, his pleroma, his divinity, the God and goal of man. To this one God, man shall pray. Prayer throws a bridge across death. And Jung responds to his encounters by saying our task is to live oneself, to fulfill what comes to you. For our life is the truth we seek. We create the truth by living it. Speaking to the spirit of the depths, Jung exclaims, let me persist in divine astonishment, so that I am ready to behold your wonders. This knowledge of the heart is in no book, but grows out of you like the green seed from the dark earth. And you attain this knowledge only by living your own life to the full, and only if you also live what you never have lived. Jung's devotion to what he encountered made him recognize, quote, that I am as I am in this visible world, and only the expression and symbol of the soul. I am thoroughly a servant of a child. And Philemon tells Jung, quote, you will be a river that pours forth over the lands and streams toward the depths. You will hold the invisible realm in trembling hands. It lowers its root into gray darknesses and mysteries of the earth, and sends up branches covered in leaves into the golden air. It will stay green for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. Anne is our last formal speaker, and we are going to go until 12:10 because we started late. And I'm first going to ask the speakers if they would like to address any questions to each other, and then invite the audience also to ask questions. And I'm going to take the prerogative of making the first two quick remarks. One thing that astonishes me is the incredible breadth of Jung's lived life. That while he was working on the Red Book and writing his 60 volumes worth of material, he was keeping a full practice, traveling around the world, present to the raising of his 5 children, and loving food and wine and art and the wind and the waters of Zurich. And so the whole celebration of the lived life was also happening simultaneously here. And last night, one of the youngest of Jung's grandsons, Hans Herne, said that what he most remembered as a 10-year-old of his grandfather was the totality of his laughter. And I just wanted to share that with you because I thought that was such a beautiful phrase, that somehow he managed to go through all this and live the full life with the totality of laughter. And the other thought that came to me as I was listening is the definition Jung gave of God when he was asked as an older man how he would define God. And he said, God is that which crosses my willful path, which is, I think, one of the great statements of always being open to the unexpected and the surprise in life. And so now I'd like to ask the speakers if they would like to address anything to each other.
I have one of those. There's a sentence, I discard, page 307 in the Red Book, I discard everything that was laden with meaning. Then Frau Jaffe writes a book called Jung's The Myth of Meaning. Can you distinguish what Jung means, what Frau Jaffe means? I mean, evidently there are two senses of meaning here, or. Because I love this thing, I discard everything that was laden with meaning. I think that's splendid, but I take it in my own way.
It's an important juncture. I think there's a critical issue of chronology there. What he describes there is entering a state of framelessness, a state of framelessness.
Framelessness.
Setting aside accrued meanings to be able to confront his own experience. In doing that, meanings are recomposed, and one finds that in the second layer of the text. Hermeneutics develops. So in that sense, I see that the first statement as a moment, almost in a Hegelian sense, on the way to an ultimate recovery of meaning.
To the eventual recovery of meaning, which then Hegelian would have to be discarded again, wouldn't it?
And then the whole shebang starts again and again.
I would say, Jim, that it's meaning and meaninglessness that he's after, so that perhaps the word emphasized should be myth rather than meaning, that you create meanings and you know that the bottom sways underneath them. And none of them are ultimate, and they will be dissolved. And if you can't take that as an inner task to live with that, it might happen to you from the outside, as I think you said, where events happen that just are terrible. They just rip up everything you thought you knew. Death is like that often. And but we as you were saying, we have images of meaning. The psyche speaks in images that strike us, and we want them, and yet the bottom sways.
Okay, I'll let that ride, yes. That's...
It comes as the fox.
Ask is somehow if one can live the meaningless life. That's what I'm thinking of.
That would be a formation that would be dissolved.
I think one has no option. That's where we find ourselves.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Except we live by the powers, so it would be the sense of life can still be filling without having the meaning.
Or the ultimate meaning eludes one, if there is one.
Yeah, exactly.
Or I think the emphasis shifts from having the meaning or not having the meaning to be in sort of a constant thrumming conversation with the powers. Mm-hmm. It's like a dance or a fox appearing, and splat, I go on the ground.
So perhaps the point there is that to have the...
We've got to have a point.
Perhaps the point then in that definition of God as that which crosses my willful path is that the fantasy of carving one's path is a willful fantasy in that sense.
You would carry the image of it. That's what's happening. Or there's another phrase here, which I didn't include because of the time, but he says, I know these experiences are of God because of their unshakableness. So there's a kind of to it.
It also strikes me that Salome is the first figure, here is the first female figure, and she's a beheader.
Oh,
Details.
And so what he's actually...
Discriminate behavior. She chooses whom she wishes to behead.
But to talk to her means you open yourself up to the experience of beheading, that everything you thought and structured your life around is challenged. Yeah.
But she doesn't behead him. He heals her.
He will behead.
Seduces her.
Well, she seduces him.
Well.
You never know who seduces who.
Exactly.
Exactly.
There is, though, a dream, he says, when followed that quotation I gave, that she coils around him like a serpent. Then the next line is, whenever I think of you, I never forget this dream I had. This is Jung, I was lying on iron spikes, and a bronze wheel rolled over me and crushed me. This is what he associates to the seduction of Salome.
He knew what he was talking about.
There's no evidence biographically that Jung was into S&M in any way. Cautionary notes.
In this sentence, that God is what crosses my willful path, does not necessarily imply that God is good and that you turn your cheek to everything that crosses your willful path. It really would be more Jacobian, that is, you struggle with whatever crosses your willful path.
Which is
But is that the heroic mistake? Or do you turn the other cheek and and love whatever crosses your willful path. Or what?
Conversation with all of the above.
What's that?
Conversation with all of the above. Who is it crossing? And
Well, it seems in the attitude that Jung has, that he has talked about in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he has these big dreams, and then he says, oh no, that means I have to work on all this material.
Yeah.
It's always dismay, you know, that he's had these huge archetypal dreams in a way. This will give me a task. So to me, that is engaging.
Engaging. Mm-hmm.
Well, also, it's not about, to return to the question of meaning, it's about a question of discrimination and differentiation of the voices, of discriminating who is there and what is there, and noting it, being alive to its, to what confronts one. I mean, there's no answer. He doesn't propose an answer there, but a kind of fidelity of recording what comes his way.
So, any burning questions?
it's hard to see.
Knowing there are no answers.
There's one up in the back.
Yes, yes. In the back there?
Wow, a mic. Could these meanings, these symbols that come, could they be relative truths that only exist in the moment and are meant to be grasped in the moment but not clung to?
I didn't hear it.
There is an explication in the text of temporality, that the highest truths, as Nietzsche put it, devalue themselves and that require regeneration. There's a chapter entitled The Ruin of Former Temples, where he talks about his former ideals and how these things necessarily degenerate. So he's faced with the collapse of everything that he held dear to his highest truths. So that is part of the predicament, is to literally allow his truths, or to witness his truths turned into falsehoods, and that lands him into this hell. He has to find his way to accept the becoming of temporality, and that is, as Anne was explicating, the figure of Abraxas. That is an acceptance of change, destruction, coming into being and destruction at the same time, and an affirmation that nothing is fixed.
And the catch is you do need something to live by. We're finite. That repetition of the image of a solid bridge into everyday life. The divine wants to live in the everyday life. So the catch is how to live with something that you're depending on, that is guiding you, and simultaneously know it is not ultimate. In that sense, it is relative, but you're living as if it's ultimate, and yet it's relative. It's that kind of, I'm there and there's a gap as well.
So we have another program this afternoon. There'll be a chance for more questions. And I wanted to thank the speakers this morning. And I also want to again thank James Hudson, who now is in the room.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov. This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.